In the end, Marvel lived. After a lot of chest beating, Carl Icahn was given a $3.5 million face-saving settlement, and he and Toybus agreed to stay out of each other's hair. The suit against Ron Perlman over all the junk bonds came out in favor of the Wizard. Yes, he had enriched himself with the money, in some cases just pocketing himself. And yes, he had used the now worthless stock of Marvel as collateral, but Perlman's people had been incredibly thorough on the bonds. It sounds like it should be illegal, but everything was completely above board, with warnings of where the money might or might not go, and it clearly understood that these were high-risk bonds. The entire meaning of high risk was that you were taking a chance. The Wizard and his team naturally landed on their feet, and among their holdings now is Saiga, a biodefense company. Perlman even had Bill Bevins appointed to its board for a time. So, if you're wondering whose job it is to protect the United States from bioterrorist threats and large-scale outbreaks of disease, it's the guys who couldn't run a comic book company without almost destroying the entire industry. Sleep tight! During this time, Rob Liefeld was busy being Rob Liefeld because nobody else wanted to. And if you want to know why, let me preface this by saying that no matter what you think of Rob Liefeld right now, unappreciated genius or talentless hack, you will still wind up with less respect for him than you do at this very moment. His Captain America run was to have been for 12 issues, but had only run for 6, and he and Jeff Loeb had plotted out all the rest of the story. To make use of that, Liefeld remembered that Joe Simon and Jack Kirby had created Fighting American after becoming pissed off over issues around Captain America. This 7-issue series was creator-owned, a fact that the Image guys no doubt would appreciate, being founded on the idea of a creator owning their work. Now, this story is often misreported. The way it's usually presented was that Liefeld brazenly created Agent America as a completely transparent copy of Captain America, then Marvel sued, and to help cover his ass, Liefeld bought the rights to Fighting American. Well, let me tell you, that is completely false. You should all be ashamed of yourselves who spread that story. Let's set the record straight here. Instead, Liefeld went to Joe Simon and to Jack Kirby's widow. The comics world had mourned the death of Jack the King Kirby less than 3 years earlier. And Liefeld said he wanted to purchase Fighting American. It's understandable. Not only is it a great fit for what Liefeld had planned, but Kirby was an idol to the Image guys. They even had the honor of publishing the first 2 issues of Kirby's Phantom Force under the Image banner, with most of the Image artists joining in to help with the inking. So Liefeld approached them about buying Fighting American, but the price they wanted for it was higher than what Rob Liefeld wanted to pay for it. And that was when he went off and produced the Agent America stuff, to use that as leverage to force them into making a deal that would be in Rob Liefeld's favor. So, I want this absolutely clear to anyone who disparages Rob Liefeld. He did not shamelessly rip off a Marvel Comics character. Come on! He was shamelessly ripping off Jack Kirby's grieving widow. Yeah, I hope you give him the apology he deserves. Despite this, Marvel sued anyway. Liefeld had changed the costume from Fighting Americans, but in doing so, Agent America now looked a lot more like Captain America, which was not helped by the fact that he had added an identical-looking shield, complete with the star on it, to a character who originally never had a shield. In the end, the judge told Liefeld to change the costume and that he could never throw the shield. If you're going to talk about fighting Marvel over their characters, then that would naturally bring us back to the most famous case, that of Steve Gerber and Howard the Duck. Gerber had created Howard as a sight gag for Adventure into Fear, but was killed off by order of Roy Thomas. But the character had so caught on that there was demands made for his return. So he was, as a backup story in the, I am not making up this title, Giant-Sized Man-Thing number 4. Giant-sized man-things no doubt would be a common occurrence in the Max line. Howard got his own book that was a cult hit, and then a newspaper strip, but due to the fact that in some foreign languages the Duck of Howard's name meant nothing other than Donald Duck, well, that was a problem because Donald and his family were being printed in comics around the world, so Disney came knocking demanding changes to Howard's appearance that Marvel wound up capitulating to, much to Gerber's profound irritation. Thing is, though, Gerber was one of those rare writer-editors that I mentioned way back in Part 2, so he responded in typical Gerber fashion. He not only refused to follow the agreement, he openly mocked it in the book, and then started ignoring it. And since nobody was looking over his shoulder there, well, he got away with it. Gerber was in turn a source of frustration for Marvel because of his chronic lateness, to the point that the Howard strip was getting dropped by some papers. Part of Jim Shooter's attempts to turn Marvel around in the late 70s was to curb tardiness, so eventually Gerber just had to go from the strip. This led to Gerber insisting that he had legal ownership of Howard, which contributed to him being fired from Marvel, the other being his lateness on other projects. And after he was gone, Disney noticed what happened and demanded that Howard be presented in the way that the companies had agreed to. Well, a little while later, Gerber's lawsuit with Marvel was starting to get expensive, so to pay for it, he created the aforementioned Destroyer Duck. And he got Jack Kirby, who had his own frustrations with Marvel, to draw the comics. And for free, no less. Everyone who worked on the book donated their services in support of Gerber. But Gerber lost, and hadn't exactly won any friends at Marvel, which was mocked at Destroyer Duck many times. Jim Shooter decided to retaliate by creating a thinly disguised Steve Gerber character for Secret Wars 2, and relentlessly mocking him. Gerber planned a bit of lampooning of his own when, per his contract, he was offered the chance to write Howard when the Lucasfilm movie came out. But Shooter's changes to Gerber's script for Howard the Duck's Secret Crisis, a parody of mega crossovers, convinced him that he should leave the project. Now, to be fair, while Gerber would characterize this as Marvel will dish it out but apparently can't take it, the changes have been publicly revealed, and basically they revolved around two things. Gerber trying to roll back the Disney changes, which obviously Marvel couldn't do, and labeling everything that had been written by others about Howard as a fiction. And Shooter, who was trying to wrangle the feuding between Byrne and Claremont at the time, was afraid that this was just going to lead to more conflict that in the end wasn't going to make the books better anyway. Gerber did wind up doing a few projects through Marvel. The lawsuit cast a shadow of debt over his life that he never really recovered from. But then an opportunity presented itself with Malibu. Image was published through them, but they wanted to hedge their bets. So just as Image was founded on superstar artists, Malibu's universe would be for famous writers, and Steve Gerber was one of those that signed up. He said it was a chance to go back to the way Marvel used to be. Finally, he wouldn't have them meddling with his work, and the new Malibu production process made the books look great. So great, in fact, that Marvel bought Malibu in order to acquire it, and after doing so, canceled all the books. Not long after, Jerry Calabrese was doing a CompuServe chat to try to sell the Heroes Reborn plan, but instead was electronically tarred and feathered by people over all the awful things that Marvel had been doing, and giving an opportunity for Gerber to jump in with some snide remarks. It wasn't as if he had anything better to do with his book canceled, was it? So he had the time to focus on that frank discussion with the management they really needed to have. Well, that was the old management. The issue with Marvel was now settled. Toy Biz had emerged triumphant. And Ike Perlmutter showed up at the office, found Joe Calamari a year after he fired his partner Avi Arad on behalf of Icon, and then promptly canned him. It was unlikely that was personal, though. Perlmutter went through executives and editorial staff like it was a slasher film, and even made the huge mistake of trying to get Stan Lee's $500,000 a year salary for life cut in half and turned into a 2-year renewable contract. After Stan had been loyal throughout the bankruptcy and cheering on Marvel and Hollywood and even publicly stating that he hoped Toy Biz would win out, it really felt like a betrayal, and Perlmutter quickly realized that he'd stepped in it big time. Now you might be saying, does Stan really need $500,000 a year for what he was contributing to the comics? And of course the answer would be no, but Stan's contribution wasn't to the books, it was to the image of Marvel. And make no mistake, that was vital right now. Marvel needed their living Walt Disney more than ever to try to placate war-weary Marvel fans and the negative reputation that Marvel had earned under the previous management, decimating the distribution system, shamelessly using lawyers to destroy the competition, strip-mining the comics industry, and uncaring about the mom-and-pop stores across the country that had to close their doors forever because of Marvel's greed. What they needed more than anything at this moment was to distance themselves from the image of Marvel as the villain, to be the saviors that rescued the company that had lost its way under the previous management. Going after the man who was the company's icon, the one who in many people's minds was the living link to the past when Marvel was a bastion of creative excellence, was the worst mistake the new Marvel management could have possibly made. It backfired so hard, Lee wound up with a far, far better off deal than he had before. After that, Perlmutter nursed a serious grudge for the man synonymous with the company that he'd bought. But the excessive cost-cutting efforts that were killing Marvel morale continued, which new CEO Ellen Bogan did his best to curtail. There was a dynamic clash of personalities, a CEO from the entertainment industry and an owner who'd made his fortune nickel and diming things to death. Perlmutter ordered an audit to take place to ensure that any overpayments be caught and reconciled. Every corner that could be cut was. It wasn't long after the change of management that Steve Gerber got a letter from Marvel about the Spider-Man team-up book. A nice reminder of that hollow victory when he rescued Howard from Marvel. The Savage Dragon Destroyer Duck team-up had shown up months late. Not really surprising, considering Gerber and Image had a history of chronic lateness. But the result was that what little interest there had been in the book had waned. The sales were so bad that few even noticed what had happened. It seemed Gerber just couldn't catch a break. His attempt at a take that flopped, and he had helped launch a Howard the Duck revival for Marvel. It was almost like every time Marvel entered his life, things went disastrously wrong. Oh, almost forgot. That letter from Marvel said he was overpaid for the Spider-Man book and included a bill for $53. At this point, it no doubt seemed that Marvel exists solely to screw with the mind of Steve Gerber. With all the energy focused on the accounting books, it's no surprise that the comic books were still struggling. A number of the creative forces had been fired off or driven off during the bankruptcy or because of Perlmutter's draconian crackdowns. And most damning, the X-Men books were not positioned to take advantage of the interest that the X-Men film generated. Harris may have kept his head down before, but to his credit, after things had stabilized, he had butted heads with Perlmutter many times over the penny pinching that was taking what little soul was left at Marvel and grinding it under heel. That, combined with his failure to capitalize on the X-Men film, resulted in him being shown the door, replaced by Joe Quesada, whose Marvel Knights line was going strong even while the rest of the books suffered. Most glaring was the flagship character, Spider-Man. John Byrne was invited back to do a retelling of Spider-Man's first year in a series called Chapter 1, but Byrne had come to see himself as the fixer due to his success with the post-crisis Superman. And when he and Howard Mackie took control of the two Spider-Man titles that survived the rebooting, the original Amazing Spider-Man and, surprisingly, Peter Parker Spider-Man, the book that had originally been McFarlane's vanity project, Byrne ejected Spider-Man's previous history and replaced it with his own. After a brief sales increase, Spider-Man soon shrank even further. Even people who had stuck it out through the Clone Saga had reached their limit and were leaving in droves. It had not been helped that during those years Harris had issued further decrees that rankled the staff, such as demanding that Aunt May be brought back to life somehow with no knowledge of Spider-Man's true identity, and Mary Jane was turned into a distant, unrelatable supermodel and then killed off. But living Aunt May and unmarried Spider-Man was back to basics, the same philosophy that was used when Marvel dictated to Peter David that the Hulk be an angry green idiot. Peter David had started that book the month after Todd McFarlane had his first big break in comics getting to draw it, and right now, McFarlane had numerous companies, a feature film, and an animated series, while David was still happily telling his Hulk stories that had turned it from a book that nobody wanted to write to a critically acclaimed series. Yet Marvel was quite happy to fire him if he resisted, and resist he did, so the Hulk became an angry green idiot, and the book was once again in the toilet. During this time, Bill Jemas was made president of Marvel, having been involved previously in, of all places, Skybox. Jemas was also a believer in this back-to-basics approach and was of half a mind to destroy the Marvel Universe and start over. Instead, the Ultimate line was created, starting with Ultimate Spider-Man. Quesada brought in Brian Michael Bendis, who had been doing fill-in work on Daredevil whenever Kevin Smith fell behind, in order to do the writing, and Mark Bagley, famous for his work on Amazing Spider-Man after Eric Larson had left the title. There was some nervousness, though. Chapter 1 still left a bad taste in the mouth of fans, so initial plan was for a 6-issue limited series to serve as a jumping-on point for readers. Instead, Ultimate Spider-Man would become one of the longest combined artist-writer runs on a book in Marvel history. But while the Ultimate line was joining Marvel Knights as another success for the recovering company, Jemas was proving an even more frustrating figure to Marvel fandom than even Perlman had been. In an interview discussing the Max line, he said, this is an actual quote, "We have quite a few male readers who live in the basement of their parents' house in Queens. For them, an evening with Elektra is as good as it gets." To the surprise of absolutely no one, fans were outraged by this, so Jamis responded again. Now, this is not an actual quote, but the spirit of his response would be, "There might be some confusion over what I had said. One could think I was saying our customers are sad men, for whom the only joy in their life is to be found in a high-quality story such as those found in the pages of Elektra. Well, that's not what I mean. I mean they're masturbating." His actual response managed not just to insult his male readers, whom he referred to as fanboys, and when asked to clarify it said, "If you're reading this, you're a fanboy," but to further disregard female readers by treating Elektra not as a character, but TNA with a face attached. His remarks about Elektra's spankable ass made clear that the Max line wasn't so much about artistic freedom as it was to pander through brazen nudity or over-the-top violence. The sad part is that this hadn't been the intention for the Max line at all. Oh sure, there was definitely that. When Stan Lee was questioned about some of the horrific things Nick Fury did, he offered up a rare criticism of what was going on. Other series were likewise met with public scorn, like Deadpool, which had crossed the line into mean-spiritedness, or The Rawhide Kid, where, try not to be too surprised, a former writer for Howard Stern writes a gay cowboy in a way that wasn't exactly going to win him a GLAAD award. While the Max line had been introduced to offer great creative freedom, such as for the foul-mouthed hero in Alias, the reputation Jamis and these disasters were creating in the minds of comic book fans was that Max was Marvel's anti-Vertigo. It was here to shock and pander, not to tell stories with sophistication beyond the bounds of a Comics Code Authority-approved book. To try to make use of this new freedom, one of the first Max line books was Howard the Duck, written by Steve Gerber, and after everything had happened, you no doubt are wondering how that could possibly happen. Well, let me explain. The Max line was being overseen by Stuart Moore, formerly of Vertigo, who called up Gerber because Phil Winslade, an artist who had worked with Gerber previously, was pushing to have a Howard Max book done with Gerber doing the writing. After his previous experience with Marvel, not to mention getting a bill from them for it, Gerber was hesitant, but given the two people involved, he was willing to at least give it a shot. Except Joe Quesada wasn't sold on it. He thought that Howard was dated and irrelevant, and he wanted Gerber to submit a story to effectively audition to write the book about his own creation. By now it should be obvious that Gerber does not submit meekly to anything, so he responded with what he called the most offensive thing that he'd ever created, something so wrong on every level that no one would ever publish it. What he wasn't aware of, though, was offensive seemed to be Jamis's entire approach to marketing. So not only did they not cancel the book right then and there, and probably burn the script and dump holy water on the ashes, instead they came back to him and said, "We love it! When can we make this book?" He says one of the few times he was actually stunned into silence. But one sticking point was the Disney design of Howard. Gerber still despised it, and the Marvel management wasn't crazy about it either. And what's worse, a check into it revealed that they weren't allowed to make any changes to Howard's design. Gerber was so pissed off he nearly quit the project right then and there, and he tried coming up with all kinds of ways around it. For instance, changing the name to Leonard the Duck, since after all, the agreement was for Howard the Duck, so it wouldn't apply to any other character, would it? But instead he decided to change Howard into various other animals. Then he could do whatever he wanted with it. And he started with a mouse to give Disney his own little slap in the face to them. With the reins effectively off once again, and the freedom the Max line offered, Gerber's 6-issue miniseries, often using foul language and nudity to make its point, provided both a commentary on the industry and an exploration of topics that Gerber felt needed discussing, culminating in a conversation with God and Howard about the universe. That God may be the creator, but it was a work-for-hire job, just as Howard had been ruled by the courts during his lawsuit. Gerber enjoyed himself so much, in fact, that he was hoping it would be extended into a regular series, or have numerous additional miniseries, but the sales weren't strong enough, and sadly, it would be the last time Gerber wrote Howard before his death in 2008. 1 year before Disney, yeah. But while he had allowed Gerber that creative freedom, overall, Jamis was just frustrating the Marvel fans to no end. His contentious attitude, combined with the way the original Marvel Universe and Ultimate Marvel Universes were being inequitably treated, suggested to many that these moves were a deliberate ploy to justify discontinuing the original altogether and trying to drive away the vocal fans to make room for a new generation. In the most infamous tale, Jamis dictated that the Fantastic Four move to the suburbs where Reed Richards would be a scatterbrained creator of useless inventions, forcing Sue to work as a secretary who used her invisibility to hide from her boss when he was mad. The problem, those close to him in the company had said, was that Jamis was often the smartest man in the room, but because of that, he believed he was the smartest man in every room. Bridges seemed to be deliberately, gleefully burned as old guard writers like Byrne, Claremont, and Mackie were either pulled off projects or canceled. And Jamis publicly declared that some who had written Marvel's highest-selling books during the 90s had only had the job to reap huge rewards thanks to exchanging favors rather than because of their talent, that they only got the job through cronyism. When Peter David publicly challenged the Marvel leadership over their treatment of his new book, Captain Marvel, Jamis turned it into a public three-ring circus, challenging David to see if he could make a better book than Jamis, and stating that David only put out 2 or 3 good books a year, the rest were just stupid in-jokes. And this was despite the fact that notoriously fickle science fiction legend Harlan Ellison had publicly praised Captain Marvel. Jamis's Marvel, which he wrote, was a disaster, and I speak as someone who had to suffer through all 6 issues for my comic review gig. It was devoid of even a whiff of talent on Jamis's part. In some parts, a parody comic that explained the joke before or after, or sometimes both. The irony was apparently lost on Jamis when he said at the end that as president it was unlikely a book like Marvel could ever be made otherwise, because apparently it's not cronyism if you hire yourself. But what was amazing was when something no one had ever expected happened. Marvel, who had once done so well DC had wanted them to make their comics, had once done so well that they were threatened with an antitrust lawsuit for dominating the market, found themselves with a smaller market share than DC. And it wasn't because of a surge. DC was growing very slowly but steadily, while Marvel was actually losing sales. And it's hardly surprising. What with Harris's creative interference and indecision, and Bill Jamis's shocking inability to treat his staff and audience like human beings. Grant Morrison, who had been butting heads with Jamis repeatedly, made that point clear when he signed an exclusive deal with DC. And when confronted by Quesada over this unexpected move, Morrison railed against Jamis and declared, "The Marvel era is done!" Now, this did only refer to sales through Diamond, so the trade paperbacks in places like Barnes & Noble wouldn't be a factor. But still, it would take nearly 3 years before Marvel was once again consistently outperforming DC, and not by the margins that it used to. And it was clear to all that Jamis was causing more problems than he was solving with his treatment of fans, staff, and talent, to the point that Perlmutter finally removed him. An interesting twist. Perlmutter, a man the staff referred to as a tyrant, who would interrupt a conference call over a $30 invoice and forbid watching TV during lunch, found Jamis too harmful for morale. Still, before Jamis leaves the story, we should admit 2 things. First, that despite his Donald Trump level of egomania, his scorn for his own customers, and his tendency to verbally abuse the staff like a drill sergeant, Marvel was set on the right path when Jamis came aboard to recover. It was just that after fixing it, he kept fixing it until he'd broken it again. But also, as much of an unparalleled asshole as he was, even Jamis had his limits. During a meeting, word came in that Stan Lee's company, Stan Lee Media, had gone under and his partner ran off to Brazil with $250,000 of Lee's personal money. At that, Perlmutter and his cronies had a good laugh at Stan's misfortune, while Quesada was shocked and even Jamis was visibly uncomfortable with their behavior. There were some things in the Marvel office so low that even Jamis wouldn't sink to them. And those weren't the ones who were being shown the door. In our final part, we'll see how these events resolve themselves with Adapt or Die.